Today, 29th of August 2016, our embassy in Washington, Ecuador's embassy in Washington, has just handed in to the State Department a letter. This letter is signed by 9 foreign ministers of South and Central American governments, and it is a letter to Secretary of State John Kerry. In this letter, the foreign ministers of 9 governments, namely Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Mexico. This is not in alphabetical order, but from south to north. We demand of Mr. John Kerry, Secretary of State, to revise the US's immigration policies towards Cuba. US immigration policies towards Cuba is discriminatory of the rest of Latin America. It is very favorable to Cuban citizens migrating to the United States. Within the first few hours, they get what is called in the United States parole, and after a year, residency, and some of them even after 4 or 5 years can apply to US nationality, which is clearly not the case for other Latin American countries. We have Ecuadorian, Mexican, Salvadorian, Colombian citizens living irregularly, irregular migrants to the United States, who decades after arriving still fear deportation. So very discriminatory towards the rest of Latin America and very favorable to Cuban migration towards the United States. Now, in this letter, we demand of John Kerry the revision of US law and norms and executive policies with regards to Cuban migration. In particular, the dry foot, wet foot policy, which was a policy implemented in the 1990s, which basically establishes that a Cuban citizen touching US territory is given this preferential treatment. And it is this very policy which is currently creating a migratory crisis in a number of countries, and which has motivated this letter on behalf of 9 states who are at this moment victim to this migratory crisis, namely Cuban citizens traveling through our countries in very vulnerable position, basically in the hands of traffickers, of people who in a criminal fashion make a lot of money off the back of vulnerable migrants. This affects the human rights of the Cuban migrants in the first place, who put themselves in a very vulnerable position. There are lots of cases of violence, assassination, sexual violence, rape, etc., etc. And this situation is also affecting the stability, the security of the countries that this big wave of Cuban migrants go through. Basically, the countries that have decided, that have opted to sign this letter to our colleague, Secretary of State John Kerry. This is a historic letter. It's the first time that such a letter has been signed by such a large group of Latin American states, calling upon the United States to do something about this, basically to turn a page from this discrimination, from these policies, particularly a dry foot, wet foot policy. This is also the first time that Cuba is not involved. Cuba has been systematically asking for the end to a number of policies that prejudice the island, including the migration issues. But in this case, it is a letter signed by foreign ministers of states that are basically transit states, and where there's a clear issue both regarding the vulnerability and the human rights of the migrants themselves and the stability of the countries that these migrants transit through. We think it's a historic step, and we hope that our letter is heeded by Mr. John Kerry, that he can answer our request for a high-level meeting. This is one of the demands of the letter, and that we can have a serious and meaningful debate about turning a page to these old Cold War policies, and this is one of them, and put an end to this ridiculous policy of dry foot, wet foot.